Hi everyone, welcome back to the GCSE English Revision channel. This week you'll be looking at Remains with me, Miss Lamb. Please make sure you have your pen and flashcards ready so that we can make notes as we go along. So Remains was written by Simon Armitage, who was born in West Yorkshire. Before getting into poetry, he worked as a probation officer and has always shown some sort of interest in the impact of violence on people. This is a theme that is reflected in his poem Remains. So Remains is one poem that's taken from the Not Dead, a series of poems that were published in 2008 and are based on interviews conducted with servicemen after they returned home from active duty. The soldier in this particular poem recalls his account of fighting in Iraq. The speaker clearly struggles with post-traumatic stress disorder, which is a common mental condition of service personnel. Armitage is concerned with the impact of war on those that are directly involved in the fighting. He shows that being a soldier is not a simple job and can have massive repercussions on the mental health and well-being of those that are following orders. Ultimately, it is a poem that focuses on the horrors of war and how this infiltrates life at home. So the structure and form of a poem is how it's been written. When discussing the structure, it's really important for you to be able to analyse exactly why the writer has done this, why he's used these devices. It's important for us also to remember that Armitage in this case has made deliberate choices to help reflect the speaker's pain and anguish as he retells this horrific story. So firstly, he writes his poem using 7 stanzas with a couplet to end. The couplet could signify the traumatising effect of war that the soldier continuously experiences, especially when he's out of the war zone. He is troubled with the guilt of having blood on his hands, even when he goes home. Additionally, there is no clear rhyme scheme used in Remains. This poem is written in free verse, which could imply the speaker's inability to control his thoughts and emotions. It's almost as if he's speaking in a stream of consciousness as he's reliving these memories. His thoughts just keep coming to him. The fact that the poem is also written in first person makes us believe that we are listening to the speaker's own account. It's personal. He's reliving his own individual experiences. Anecdotal style also makes it sound as if it's an informal chat, almost as if he's about to tell us an amusing story. This soon changes, however, in stanza 5, where there is a clear shift in tone. The volta used here forces the poem to become a lot more emotional, as we see the speaker is plagued by his actions. He clearly becomes angrier and reveals the effects of PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder as he continues to describe how he cannot escape from this torment. Finally, the caesura used throughout the poem could reflect the speaker's attempt to regain control of his thoughts. The use of the caesura in the line, "end of story, except not really," could signify the speaker's inability to return home as he usually would. He is troubled by his memories and he cannot forget what has happened in the war zone. The bluntness of this opening sentence of stanza 5 is hard-hitting as we realise the speaker cannot leave his work behind. It infiltrates every single aspect of his life. It's important for us to remember that Armitage has used these structural devices to reflect the chaos of the speaker's thoughts. The speaker is forced to relive these haunting memories, and ultimately he is traumatized by the actions of war. So let's move on to language analysis then. The ending line of the first quatrain, "probably armed, possibly not," continues to show us this theme of inner conflict. There is a sense of doubt in the speaker's voice here. Even though he's been sent into another highly charged situation, it's clear that he's battling with himself, as he doesn't know whether this man is guilty or innocent. Moreover, the theme of guilt is shown here, as we see he is constantly reviewing his actions in his own head. The speaker is tormented by the thoughts of this man and whether killing him was actually the right thing to do. We also have the repetition of this doubt as he discusses the likelihood of this man being armed, probably or possibly. It is clear that the soldier is blindly following orders and does not have enough information to make an informed decision. The plosives here, at the beginning of probably and possibly, could also signify the disdain the speaker has for his own brutal actions. Furthermore, this line is repeated in line 22, which represents the speaker's inability to control his own thoughts. He is haunted by the part he played in killing this man, and he clearly cannot stop wondering whether the looter was innocent or not. The metaphor used at the beginning of stanza 3 sharply contrasts with the colloquial language of the first two stanzas. We are forced to see just how traumatizing these high-pressured situations are. This is the first time we also see the first person pronoun I, which could signify the speaker's acknowledgement of his role in this killing. The metaphor, I see every round as it rips through his life, highlights the impulsive decision made by the soldier to begin shooting without making an informed decision. War here, then, is presented as being grotesque and chaotic. The speaker sees every round, which highlights that he may be troubled by what he's done, and is constantly reliving his part in the shooting. It's almost as if he had become detached and watches this horror as he sees himself being so callous. The verb rips also creates a grotesque image as we see the disdain the soldiers have for this looter. However, it could also hint at the speaker's guilt as he feels remorse for committing this heinous act. The line, sort of inside out, gives us the impression that the speaker has not properly processed the death of this man. He sounds almost childish as he describes the horrific scenes. It is clear that he is traumatized by this image, so much so he cannot remove it from his head. The line tosses his guts back into his body creates a bleak and horrifying image. The speaker sounds indifferent at this point, though there is a sense of his guilt as he relives the memory. The use of the verb tosses creates a casual tone, as if this is a usual occurrence during war, as if the speaker had become desensitized to it whilst fighting. It's only whilst he is retelling the story that we see he is deeply affected by his nonchalant attitude. In each of these quotations, Armitage uses extremely graphic imagery. He describes the man's death in gory detail, which implores the reader to realise the true horrors of war, but also shows us how the speaker had become so desensitised to the brutality of war as it was part of his everyday life. This line, in my opinion, perfectly encapsulates the mood of the entire poem. The speaker is tormented by his role in war, and he cannot escape from it. He begins abusing drink and drugs in a way to sort of self-medicate, to control his paranoia and regain some form of control. However, this is unsuccessful. The nightmares and the haunting memories can't be eradicated. He cannot cure the unwanted flashbacks himself, and he is mentally trapped. So the use of the verb flush, for example, suggests that he's desperate for the memories to be eradicated, but they cannot leave him. He cannot get rid of them. Finally, we see the themes of individual experiences and inner conflict in this line, as we see that the looter is now a permanent fixture of the speaker's mind. At the beginning of the poem, he was sort of detached from the looter, but now, as the poem progresses, we see that actually he cannot escape from this looter. He's constantly an image in the back of his head. And for our final part of language analysis, we see between these two quotes the stark contrast between the beginning and the end of the poem. In the first line, myself and somebody else, we see the speaker's reluctance to admit his guilt at the beginning of the poem. He blames not only himself but other people to show that he is not solely responsible for the horrific actions of killing this looter. The repetition of somebody else further emphasises he is protesting his innocence to show that he is not alone in this action. Additionally, we see the speaker finally admit to his actions. So by the end of the poem, in the final line, his bloody life in my bloody hands, he does not blame anybody else and he accepts that he was responsible. The use of the personal pronoun my shows the speaker's realization that he has to live with this guilt forever. The metaphor of his bloody hands could refer to the speaker's guilt as he envisions the blood on his hands, much like Lady Macbeth did. Perhaps the speaker is unbalanced and emotional after reliving these haunting memories. So if we consider the poet's attitudes then, overall Armitage's poem gives a voice to the experiences of soldiers that are not necessarily heard from. He gives these soldiers a platform to share their concerns and recount the true horrors of war. Armitage emphasises the traumatizing effects of war on those that are directly involved in the conflict. Perhaps the poet comments on the fact that PTSD has always been a condition that has been misunderstood, particularly in World War One, with shell shock and people not necessarily understanding how demanding war actually is. He writes in such a hard hitting and blunt tone to highlight the serious nature of this subject, and also brings awareness to ordinary people that soldiers struggle and are also victims of war. Finally, a bit of comparison, because that is what you are tested on in this paper. So, whilst you could compare Remains to a wide range of poems in the anthology, one particular poem that stands out is Duffy's War Photographer. As you can see, War Photographer links to the themes of the effects of conflict, memory, guilt, and individual experiences. Both Armitage and Duffy explore each of these themes. So if we start with the effects of conflict, Remains focuses on the impact of war on those that are directly involved in battle, whilst War Photographer focuses on the impact of those that are not. The war photographer is on the sidelines. Okay. It is clear that the soldier in Remains is completely devastated by his actions in the war, whilst the war photographer is disappointed in the ignorance of ordinary people for the harsh job he has to do. Thinking about memory and how Remains and War Photographer compare in that aspect, both poets explore the impact war has on the memory of a soldier and a war photographer, so both very different roles. Both the soldier and the war photographer are haunted by the memories of their jobs. Both appear to be unstable and emotional, especially as the war photographer's hands tremble as he begins to develop the photographs. It is clear that they are both disturbed by the memory of their experiences. Moving on to guilt, it's clear that both of the people in Remains and War Photographer feel guilt for their role in the war. They both have a job to do and therefore feel guilty for completing it. They both seem to be traumatized by what they have experienced during the war and feel guilty for how they have behaved. And finally, individual experiences. So again, both poems, Remains and War Photographer, explore the theme of guilt and how this impacts the individual as they return home from the war zone. They are both deeply haunted by their own experiences, and both poets tell the story from a different perspective to encourage the reader to feel sympathy for the subjects of their poems. Thank you all for listening, and remember to bring your flashcards in on Thursday ready for your quiz.